Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. The subject of today's episode is what is logic and what are paradoxes? So I'm going to start off by saying something about definitions. So it's fairly obvious that we should agree on definitions when we're talking, when we're debating, when we're discussing something. And anybody who's into philosophy, has seen, or really pretty much any kind of discourse, any kind of argumentative discourse, has seen the classic situation of two people going at it, really debating, and they seem to be going in circles, but they're going at it. And for anyone on the outside, it's fairly clear that what's going on is that they don't agree about their definitions. And so now they get to a point where they're essentially arguing about what a word means, and they don't agree. And the thing about what a word means is that to some extent, it's arbitrary, right? To some extent. I'm going to say more about it in a moment. But you get into the situation that people derisively talk about by saying, oh, well, that's semantics. And I always find that funny because I think that if you don't clarify your semantics, anything that follows is just two people talking past each other without actually talking to each other. So, I understand the frustration about semantics because, again, to some extent, what words mean is arbitrary. So why are we arguing about that? We're missing the substance if we stay on that. But if we don't make sure to do that first, then there's no discussion to be had at all. I want to say a bit more about this point because I think it seems trivial at first and obvious, but I think it has stronger implications than people realize. And I'm going to start off by quoting Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein, from his Blue Book. Now, it doesn't matter what the history of the Blue Book is. I'll put a link to it and maybe some words about it in the description. But in the Blue Book, there's a moment where Wittgenstein is talking about a hypothetical solipsist. So a solipsist is somebody who believes that the external world is not real, that they're the only thing that's real. Basically somebody who says, well, I'm the only thing that I'm sure of and that I kind of experience, so only I'm real. Other people are other things and other people are illusions, whatever. Funny thing about solipsists is that philosophers love to talk about them and to refute them, but there are very few actual solipsists. So, probably the most impressive straw man in the history of philosophy. Anyway, Wittgenstein is talking about some hypothetical solipsist who says typical solipsistic things like, only my pain really exists, or only what I see is real. And Wittgenstein says, look, don't think of this person as saying that, when I turn away, the tree that I was looking at magically vanishes. It was there and now it was real and now it's not real because I no longer see it. Don't think of the solipsist as saying, when somebody says that they're in pain, they must be lying because only I'm in pain. Really, the solipsist isn't saying something very different from what anybody else would say, substantially speaking. But really, the solipsist is just trying to convince us that we should use the word exist or the word real in a different way than we typically do. Okay? It sounds like he's making a substantive and really shocking claim, but really the only claim he's making is this word should mean something other than what it does. Now, I want to read you a quote. Once Wittgenstein gets to this point, he writes, that is, he objects to using this word in the particular way in which it is commonly used. On the other hand, he is not aware that he is objecting to a convention. He sees a way of dividing the county different from the one used on the ordinary map. He feels tempted, say, to use the name Devonshire, not for the country with its conventional boundary, but for a region differently bounded. He could express this by saying, isn't it absurd to make this a county, to draw the boundaries here? But what he says is, the real Devonshire is this. So, I really love this quote because I think most arguments ultimately, we don't realize it, but they ultimately come down to two people saying the real Devonshire is this, right? And that process of naming, of saying this is the thing that should be called Devonshire, okay, is extremely powerful and useful. But because we do it unconsciously and because we're constantly at odds with each other, we're constantly at odds with each other about how to do it, and we don't realize that that's what we're at odds about, we end up confused. Okay, so now let's say that we are now about to have a debate about something, and so I'm about to put forward an argument about what logic is, okay? So how do I start? How do I avoid saying, this is what logic really is, like the guy about Devonshire? So first of all, I think in terms of a process about how to do this, it does help to start by identifying and respecting what the convention is. Because there is a sense in which naming is arbitrary, right? So if there's a convention and it's arbitrary, why not just stick to it, right? So so start by identifying and respecting the convention. However, conventions about what words mean are usually vague, okay? People usually associate words in different ways, in different contexts. Different people associate them differently. So for the most part, we can only start there. And then we have to take account of the fact that there is this vagueness and this inconsistency and kind of mushiness. And then we've got to, in order to be clear in our discussion, and just to be clear, not to say that we have to do this with everyday life, right? But once we start talking about philosophy, if we want to get somewhere, we want to start going through this process. And that next step, after identifying what the conventions are, is to have a pragmatic analysis, okay? So we ask ourselves, what's a useful way of using this name, this word that maybe we're trying to pin down when we're about to have a discussion? And useful in regard to what? Well, useful in regard to providing clarity in the conversation we're about to have, providing expressiveness in the conversation that we're about to have. The fact that because we identify this word in such a way, there are things that we're able to say more clearly, more easily, more expressively, more precisely than if we did not choose to identify this word as being whatever it is that we're identifying it as. With that very long preamble, let me now actually get into logic. So, in trying to actually figure out what the popular convention is about what logic means, I've actually been asking people, what is logic? What do you think logic is? I've gotten a pretty wide variety of answers, and some of them are things like, oh, it's the laws of existence, or the most fundamental laws of the universe, of how the universe works. More fundamental than physics even, that kind of thing. Or something like, it's the laws of rationality. It's the laws of how reasoning works, right? Other things I get is, it's the laws of identity and non-contradiction. The logic is the fact that a thing has to be itself and cannot also be the opposite thing, or something like that. There are some problems already with this convention. Okay, so if I've looked into what the convention is and I found a bunch of different things, as more or less I expected, I start from there and I start to now do this pragmatic analysis, right? And a couple problems with some of the things that have been proposed to me as what logic is. One is that you don't want the name of this field of study to be, or this general area of inquiry, let's say. You don't want the name of it, or the definition of it, I should say, to beg any questions, right? We don't want to, in the definition of just what it is that we're inquiring about, to sneak in some answers to some potentially really important questions. Okay, so to give you an example, if I ask somebody, hey, what's economics? And that person says, well, economics is the study of how completely free markets provide everything that people need, and that process of how that goes about. If somebody said that, I would be very justified in saying back, I didn't ask you your opinion. I didn't ask you your particular school of thought. I asked you what economics means. Okay, so similar with logic, and this is targeted at any kind of definition that wants to work in something like the law of identity or the law of non-contradiction into a definition of logic. It's like, hey, hold off. We'll talk about that. Maybe you're right about those, but we're just first discussing the subject matter, right? Not our opinions about it. Another thing is that there are some fairly fundamental questions about logic that we don't want to, again, have to commit ourselves to when we're just defining what the subject matter is. For example, this whole idea that it is the laws of existence or the laws of the universe. It's kind of at odds with the other one that I mentioned, which is that it's the laws of rationality, right? One seems to imply that the source of logic is metaphysical. It's about the nature of reality, of the world, the universe, whatever you want to call it. Where the other seems to sort of say, well, it's kind of based on the nature of the mind, right? The rationality, or maybe you want to say it's language, whatever it is, however it is that you want to say the source of rationality is. But when you define logic as coming from, or actually being the laws of rationality, you're now committed to that being the source of logic. And again, as with the earlier point, when we're just defining the subject matter, we don't want to have to commit ourselves to anything one way or the other. We're just talking about what it is, right? So we want to be as non-committal as possible just in defining the subject matter. So far, I've talked about essentially my attempt at creating something like a popular convention by just asking a bunch of people. And now I want to say what I think is roughly the academic convention of what the word means. And it's one that I find pretty useful, and it'll be pretty much what I stick with as the meaning of the word. And that is that logic is the study of the rules of entailment. Another way of putting that is that it is the study of what follows from what. And yet, a third way of putting it, and all these ways are really just saying the same thing. It's that it is the study of rules of valid argumentation. Okay, so just to put it in simple terms, logic studies the laws or rules of from what kinds of statements can we derive other kinds of statements validly, right? When we're trying to make an argument, make some kind of a case, what are the valid moves and what are the rules of what those valid moves are? Now, when I put forward the idea that what logic really is that it's the study of entailment, valid argumentation, there might be a temptation to go, no. The real logic is this, right? To give the kind of real Devonshire type of response, if you are, say, somebody who thinks that logic really is, the laws of existence or whatever your pet definition might be. So one more point that I want to make about why some of those other definitions might not be as useful as this one is that, we already have words for what the laws of, let's say, the universe or the laws of reality are. And that's roughly metaphysics. Or the laws of existence, well, you might say, okay, that's roughly ontology. It's useful to have a word that is specifically just means what the rules of valid argumentation are. Okay? And then if it turns out that what the rules of valid argumentation are is given to us by facts about metaphysics or ontology or whatever it may be, that's a claim you can make, and that'll be a claim about metaphysics. It'll be the claim that logic is sourced by metaphysics, right? And that would itself be a metaphysical claim. Okay, so I've been saying entailment, valid argumentation, using them more or less interchangeably. What do I mean by them? So they're not exactly the same thing, but roughly for our purposes, we can just say that arguments are valid when they follow the rules of entailment. So here's a good question. Why do we think that there are such rules in the first place? Why are we so sure that there is such a thing as the rules of valid argumentation or of entailment? I want to put forward the case that validity is best seen as a naturally occurring phenomenon. Okay? Just like physicists notice matter in motion and then they go and they study it, right? Same thing with logicians. They notice this phenomenon of validity, and so they go and they study it. And so what is this phenomenon? The phenomenon is just the understanding that if some things are true, then some other things must be true. Okay? That's fundamentally the phenomenon that logic studies. Okay? Logic notices that it seems to be so that it just happens sometimes, right? That if some things are true, then some other things must be true. Automatically, not for any empirical reason, it just has to be that way. And so, well, how do we know that, right? How do we know that? How are we aware of that phenomenon? Fundamentally, the way that we're aware of that phenomenon is intuition. And I want to make the case that at the bottom of logic, what logic is ultimately founded on are intuitions, are the intuitions that we have about what follows from what. It's our intuitions that tell us, now that's got to be the case, right? And then starting from that, again, basically we notice that happens, and then we go, oh, well, that's an interesting phenomenon that I have this experience of being so sure that it must be the case that if this is true, then this is also true. Let me go and study that. Let me go and find out what's going on there that I'm so sure of that. So here's an argument. If it's the case that all fat animals are funny, and it's the case that Irene the cat is a fat animal, then it must be the case that Irene is funny. Why does this follow? It does seem like it does have to follow. So before we try to give any kind of a formal, logical answer to what's going on there, it's important to acknowledge that fundamentally we just feel like it has to. Okay? And I think probably for most people, if you were to ask, hey, so why does that follow? How are you so sure? They would probably do something that would be very much like just restating the same thing. It's like, well, okay, just think about it, man. If actually it's true that all fat animals are funny and Irene's a fat animal, then then because of that she's got to be funny, right? Like it would just be a kind of maybe just emphasizing of causal connection there, but it would be mostly really just repeating the same thing. And so we're at a sort of something kind of base level, and that's the thing that we're studying. Before we go into what in fact is happening in that Irene case, let's look at how arguments, the structure of arguments, let's say. So arguments, I think most people know this, right? Arguments are a bunch of premises and then a conclusion. And validity is defined as, or an argument is valid if all the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Then there's this extra thing called soundness, which is if the argument is valid and it turns out that the premises really are true, right? So not just that if they were true, but they really are true, then the argument is also sound. Okay, so you got some premises, you got a conclusion, and it's valid if the premises are true, so is the conclusion. Why would there ever be that kind of a connection, right? Again, we have that intuitive sense that there must be, but how can we put that? Okay, well, the study of logic, for the most part, deals with that by positing rules of reasoning, or essentially logical rules. Okay, rules that basically say whenever you have this kind of premise or this combination of premises, from that it must follow that something else. Okay, so we posit these rules in order to explain that sense, that understanding that things must follow. We posit that there must be some kind of a rule essentially connecting the premise and the conclusion in that necessary way. Again, what the metaphysical status of these rules are, do they really exist, or are we just positing something that is best seen as just a phenomenon? Separate question, right? That's once we really get into logic, then we can start to look at that. But again, just as a matter of just looking at what it is that logic does, it posits these rules as explanations for this sense of it must follow. Now, in the case of Irene, of the argument that I made about Irene the cat, right, the rule of reasoning there, that logical rule that I used, basically was this, right? If some property applies to all members of some category, and, some given thing is a member of that category, then that property has to apply to that given thing. Okay? Now this has a rule. This has a name. Okay? It's called universal instantiation. But again, it's important that we realize that the reason universal instantiation is true is just because when we think about it, it just seems like it obviously has to be, right? And so we give a name to that, and we give it the name universal instantiation. It's not like universal instantiation was there before, and we discovered it only in the sense that we discovered as intuitions that we have and that seem to have to follow. Okay, so now I want to talk about systems of logic. So far I've been talking about logic as the study of this phenomenon. One of the things that people who study logic want to do is they want to codify this phenomenon. They want to make a formal system with all of these posited logical rules clearly spelled out, such that by following this codified system, you would always get what you would get if you were just intuitively using logic correctly, right? Using our intuitive senses of what must follow correctly. Now that I've said that, it's important to disambiguate between these systems of logic and the phenomenon of logic, again, the thing that we actually use every day. Okay? The systems of logic are these artificially constructed systems meant to replicate what this thing that already exists does. So implied in what I just said is that logical systems are created in order to represent something. Now that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So to give you a kind of silly example, I can create a system of logic where the only logical law there is that from everything it follows that Santa Claus is thin. So, give me anything, and if that's true, then it's also true that Santa Claus is thin. So this is a pretty silly law of logic. It doesn't really seem to represent anything about the real world or how we really think or how we actually use logic. if anybody did construct such a logical law, it would probably be just to prove a point, or maybe as part of some game or something. But the larger point then is that there is what logical systems are trying to represent, and then there's the logical system itself. So a really good comparison, which I think it is pretty analogous, is with types of geometry, right? So most people have heard that there's the kind of traditional Euclidean geometry that we've been using for thousands of years, and then some people came up with some alternative kinds of geometry. And those are, and so it's not right to say, well, this type of geometry is right, this type of geometry is wrong. They're all right relative to the kind of space that they're trying to work with, right? They're all, if you take for granted a certain type of space, then this geometry is correct. If you take for granted this type of space, then this type of geometry is correct. And it's really the same with logic, right? Any system of logic might be correct relative to something that something that it's trying to represent. Now, most serious systems of logic are trying to represent logic as we use it, right? That intuitive sense of logic that we use. And so they're to be judged correct or incorrect relative to that. But again, only insofar as that's actually their aim in the first place. Okay, so if that's the case, right? So now I'm giving you this picture where you can have tons of systems of logic, and many of them are sort of competing for the title of best representation or most accurate representation of actual logic the way we really use it. So how do we evaluate, right? So let's say somebody gives me, logic A over here, and somebody gives me logic B over here. What do I do? In one sense, the most important thing that I have to evaluate when I look at these two systems of logic is that they agree with the data. What's the data? What actually is valid when we're using logic, again, intuitively, right? Assuming we're using it correctly. So, I get two systems of logic, again, A and B, and I don't know which one to choose. So I give them the Irina's funny argument. Here you go. Here's the Irina's funny argument. Here's the Irina's funny argument. Logic A, their system of logic A spits out valid. System of logic B spits out invalid. Then to me, that's huge points against system of logic B. It seems like not a very good candidate, where, logical system A, well, at least you're still in the running. You gave me the right answer on that one, right? So that seems like the most important thing that the system of logic, that's what it's there for, is to actually output what logic would output in actual use. Now consider this. So I keep logical system A in the running, but now somebody gives me logical system C. And logical system C also spits out that the Irene argument is funny. I give them both some more, and actually they're both giving me the same outputs. So I decided to go actually take a look at what these systems really look like. What are the logical laws? How do they actually work? Logical system A has a few logical laws that, when I look at them and I think about them, seem to be kind of intuitive. There's something about them that intuitively makes sense. I look at logical system C, and the way the logical system C works is that actually it creates a new law for every argument that I could possibly give it. Right? For every possible argument, it just makes a law of that argument. And the law essentially says that if it's valid, then it says that it's valid. If it's not valid, it says that it's not valid. It's as if there were a theory of physics where, in order to calculate the measurement of something, say the velocity of something, instead of giving you a formula, it just takes in the specific context in which you're measuring the velocity, and then just gives as a rule, for that context, the velocity is this. Or by context, I mean the sort of total specifications of the scenario in which you're measuring. So you would say, I guess that works, but there's something wrong with it, right? It seems outrageously sort of complex, not actually useful. No real explanatory power, right? It just seems like, okay, you've given me a list of all the correct arguments, basically. And that's not really what I was expecting. There's a sense in which it seems like that's cheating. There's a sense in which it seems like that's not very useful. So we would count that against logical system C, even though it gave all the right answers, right? It was just way, way too complex and not intuitive at all. So logical system A is doing pretty well. Got another one. Logical system D comes on. And again, both A and D agree with the data that I've given them. Both of them fairly simple. But logical system D just needs to work in a couple of exceptions. Like if it didn't have a couple of exceptions, it would give you the wrong answer for some of the arguments that you feed it. And so it deals with that by creating just a couple of exceptions here and there for those. No, that's reasonable, right? That is true to how most theories in most fields actually are in practice. But nonetheless, it's something where you have to count it as points against it. Okay, one more scenario. Now I've got logical system E. And logical system E also agrees with the data, is also simple. It doesn't have all these sort of ad hoc exceptions. But actually, there's a whole class of arguments that it just has nothing to say about, right? It's not like it outputs the wrong answer. It's just like, I don't know. I can't handle those arguments. Again, understandable, sort of reasonable. You feel for logical system E, but still, right? To the extent that logical system A doesn't have those faults, we're going with logical system A. So what I'm painting here is a picture of virtues that logical systems have. Let me give you now one more example. I think I said I was only going to give you one more the last time, but this is really just one more. F and G, okay? So we've got logical system F is much more powerful. And by powerful, I mean wider range of arguments that it can handle, okay? That it has something to say about. But it does require some exceptions in order to give you the correct data all the time. Meanwhile, we've got logical system G, and that logical system is simpler than F, doesn't require some of those exceptions, okay? But smaller range of arguments that it can handle. Again, it has a bunch of arguments that it just doesn't really know what to say about. I mean, you might say, well, between these two, if these two are my options, right? We forgot about A for the moment. If these two are my options, then, well, it's kind of a tough call. I'm going to have to wait. I'm going to actually have to look in and see, okay, what are those exceptions? Can I make sense of them? Is there a way that I can justify them so that it doesn't seem so ad hoc? Or, again, is there a reason that this class of arguments that it can't answer, that, is there a good reason why it can't answer them? And again, can I sort of justify that in a way where that won't count against it as much? And so we've got this weighing process, right? This process of comparing these virtues against each other. This process, by the way, I think the best example of it historically is the classic example of when the Copernican system was introduced at a time when everybody was used to the Ptolemaic system, right? So when the Copernican system is introduced, it actually had, a couple of flaws if you're looking at it in this way. Okay, it was less powerful than the Ptolemaic system. Okay, less predictions that it could actually make. It was also just actually less accurate than the Ptolemaic system. But it had something really big on the Ptolemaic system, which was that it was much simpler, much more intuitive. The Ptolemaic system had to have a lot of these exceptions and complications, etc. Right? But that was not really enough. So at first, it's not clear. It wasn't clear which people should pick. And it actually took a little bit of time for further developments in the Copernican system to show that it actually performed better, that it did agree with the data more, that it could make all those calculations that at first it seemed like it couldn't. Right? Once all that starts to become clear, then people start to go, okay, well, the evidence is mounting. We can all agree that the Copernican system is a better representation of what's going on. Okay, but at first, there was no guarantee of that. And that was really because people were engaged in this kind of process, whether or not they were consciously doing so, whether they were thinking of it in terms of these virtues of theory selection or not. And so part of the point there, by the way, is that the way that we choose logical systems is not all that different from the way we choose between competing theories in any field. We have to weigh all these virtues. Notice, by the way, I said, agreement with data has to be the most important virtue, since that's what the logical system is trying to do. But if you had one system that agreed with the data entirely, but had a great deal of other faults, maybe it was like, I forgot the order, maybe it was like logical system B from before that just listed out all the answers, right? If you have one like that versus one that actually disagrees with the data in some cases, but is really strong on all those other virtues, on all the other virtues, you'd probably go with that one and think, okay, there must be some reason it disagrees with the data on some of these. We can investigate further, but we'd probably think that one is probably better, right? That thing can give you the right answers, but it's useless and has no explanatory power. Okay, now I want to make a claim that is not obvious, and in fact, it would probably be pretty controversial. So here I go. I don't think that we should actually expect to ever find a single logical system that would score maximally high on all of those virtues. Okay, we should not expect to find one logical system that we will be just like, yes, that's the one, no question about it, just perfect, right? I have a couple of reasons. One is that depending on the kind of context that we're in, we may actually need to reason differently, okay? So I'll give you an example. A very commonly agreed upon law of logic is the law of non-contradiction, right? Which says basically that it cannot be the case that A, let's just call some statement A, that A is true and also not A is true. Okay, can't have that. That seems very intuitive, seems to really make sense. Now consider this scenario. Okay, it's a legal example. So we've got a situation where the law says that, if you own something, you can leave your property title to anyone so long as they're over 18. Okay. There's another law that says that convicts cannot own anything, cannot have property titles. And so, if, we have a situation where somebody leaves their property title to a convict who's over 18. Based on one law, this person now owns the property title. The convict now owns the property title. Based on the other law, the convict does not own the property title. Okay, so there's a sense in which now we're in a situation where the convict both owns and does not own the property title. What do you do? Well, we've got a contradiction, right? We've got a case where, A is true and also not A is true. So what do? Right? Notice that our brains don't explode. Okay? Actually, it wouldn't necessarily be all that hard to reason through this. Okay? By the way, we're assuming that the law is set up in such a way where there isn't it hasn't been specified, when this happens, go to, this law shall be higher, or these are not in a hierarchy of laws where one is higher than the other, right? Essentially, the lawmakers screwed up by setting up the law in this way. And that's granted, but still, assuming the situation is really occurring, we've got to deal with it, right? And so, how people would deal with it really depends on the situation, but the point is they would deal with it. And they would deal with it by starting with acknowledging the fact that both of those laws equally at play here. We've got a situation where, at least legally, according to the legal code, this person both owns and doesn't own the property title. Now, granted, this is a man-made situation, okay? But that's precisely the point, right? Depending on the context, in this case, it's a context of dealing with a man-made law. Depending on the context, we may need to reason differently. And that's one reason to think that it may not be possible to find one system of logic that perfectly represents how we actually reason, because we actually reason differently depending on context. In other words, as I said earlier, logics or systems of logic can only be evaluated relative to what they're trying to represent. It may be that we should think of systems of logic as trying to represent how we reason in contexts, relative to given contexts, and not just to how we reason or how we use logic generally. And that's not too problematic, right? And there's a sense in which somebody might say, well, all right, fine. You can have your systems of logic for legal systems and for other kinds of things like that. And somebody might say, that's fine if you want to describe things that way. In that case, I'm interested in the logic that applies most fundamentally when we reason, let's say, about physical reality, right? And when we reason about physical reality, there it becomes a lot more plausible to say, like, no way you're going to break the law of non-contradiction. Now, even within context, though, I'm skeptical about being able to find a single logic or single system of logic that sort of fit all, even within a context. This goes back to that question that I posed at the beginning about where does logic come from? Does logic come from the nature of reality? Is it given to us by metaphysics? Or does it come from the nature of rationality, right? How our minds work, how we think about things. And it seems fairly obvious to me that the source of the laws of logic is the interplay between the two, right? That the reason that anything follows from anything is fundamentally because of how things are and because of how we think, and that it is impossible to take one or the other out of that. To take one of those away from the equation. So let me give you a kind of trivial example, right? And this will seem silly, but I'll explain. So the truth of this statement, this ball is red, depends on both the state of the ball, the facts about this ball, and also about what the words red and ball and this, or all the words in the sentence, what they mean, right? And how it is that we use them in our language. So without either of those two things, the truth of that statement goes out the window. The reason that's kind of a silly example, it's kind of trivial, is that you can hold the meaning of words constant, right? So instead of saying like, all right, fine, of course that, the truth value of statements depends on what the words in the statement mean, okay? But in order to get past being stuck in talking only about words, let's hold the meanings of the words constant, okay? And then talk just about the things that they represent. And then we'll be able to really just talk about things and not just about words. So there's where I would make a case that's less obvious, and it would probably take more than just a couple of minutes in this video to really make a strong case for it. But I'm going to make the case that even if you hold the meanings of words constant, the identity of things as they are is given to us by how our language is set up. So let me be clear about what I mean by that. I don't actually mean that by speaking or by setting up language in a certain way, we literally create stuff, right? My view is that physically speaking, things are just the way that they are, right? They're just what they are, and that's it. There's a sense in which there's nothing more to be said about things than just that they are the way that they are, right? Once we start being able to say things, is when we start to demarcate amongst things with words, right? We start to name things. We say, okay, well, that thing is this, and that thing is that. And when we do that, right, we don't just arbitrarily assign names. We do that as well, but we also arbitrarily assign the demarcations, right? We say we say this is an object, and that object has the name whatever, right? Now, even if we hold the name constant, the point is that we're assuming that that is a distinct object. Okay, now, pretty much all logical systems, all serious logical systems work around the idea that we have objects and objects have predicates, right? But objects as objects are fundamentally created by the naming process, right? There's nothing necessary about there being objects in the world as opposed to just the way that things are without our naming process. And there's really there's other ways that language could do things, right? So you could have a language, you can envision having a language where rather than it being oriented around objects and their predicates, they could be oriented around events. And what we typically think of as objects as being sort of events or temporal kind of slices of a phenomenon. And really there's other ways that you could think of things than as just objects organized in the way that we typically tend to see them and name them. Now, that's not to say that where we draw our demarcations is totally arbitrary. It's not, right? It's very much based on pragmatics, on usefulness, right? On how we actually have evolved to engage with the world. But the point is that it is not given. It is not something that couldn't be another way. Okay, which means that in a very important sense, how we've constructed our language based on all of these pragmatic decisions, for the most part unconscious decisions or emergent decisions over time that we've socially agreed upon when we've created languages, right? All of those decisions have actually given us what are the objects that we're then going on and talking about when we just use language generally, and certainly when we're using logic. So that the kind of grammar of the language that we happen to use, and certainly of the logic that we happen to use, is something that is fundamental to whether statements are true or false, even if we hold the meanings of the words constant. There's a couple. There's one more reason, I think, to think that, and it's related actually to what I just said, to think that we shouldn't expect to find one logic within, even within context, one system of logic, even within context, that'll perfectly work. And that is that language, as I mentioned, is something that emerged over time, and I buy the modern sort of scientific story that it emerged as a result of evolutionary imperatives. Okay, that it emerged as a tool for us to use, that evolution essentially selects for. Do we really have a reason for thinking that these imperatives, these evolutionary imperatives, sort of guided us toward creating a language in which, and a sort of habit of thinking, let's say, in which all of our implicit logical rules, right? Because we normally don't consciously think about logic, we just use it, right? So in which all of these logical rules cohere perfectly and come together into a neat, unified system. There's really no reason to assume that must be the case, right? There's actually good reason to think that, to some extent, evolution would kind of ignore that, well, let's not ignore. I'm giving sort of agency to evolution, which is a common mistake. But, that virtue of unification, of elegance, would be something that evolution wouldn't really select for as much as it would select for, everyday pragmatics. And that everyday pragmatics, don't necessarily have to come together into one clear, perfect system that perfectly reflects how we actually think and reason. So for all of these various reasons, I think that if you're somebody who's interested in logic and in evaluating systems of logic, we should really take to heart this weighing of virtues process, not towards the end of finding the one true logic, but rather as a weighing process in which you evaluate which is the best, admittedly not perfect logic for this fairly particular range of contexts, and in a way that acknowledges that this may change as some of the circumstances of the context change. It might change over time, right? That it's not a sort of perfect thing that we're looking for. Now, if you took the result of what I just, let's say, you put me at work for a while, given what I just explained, and you gave me a bunch of situations and contexts, and I went around evaluating systems of logic, and I came out and said, well, look, for these kinds of contexts, for the most part, you want to use this kind of logic, although I found that sometimes it has problems in this type of area, and so maybe there you want to take all of that I come up with and call that a system of logic. It's going to fare kind of poorly in at least one area. That's simplicity, right? And so this kind of pragmatic approach that I take, it does entail missing out a bit on that virtue of simplicity. And that actually is, a problem. That is, that's a legitimate virtue that my argument doesn't score so well on. But I think all things considered, right, I think the story that I just gave about why we shouldn't expect that level of simplicity helps us swallow it a bit better, right? It just seems to justify it, at least to my mind. And I would think taking that attitude, where you allow yourself to not expect perfect elegance and simplicity and cohesion, that you might fare somewhat well on the other virtues. So, that's sort of my my case for that kind of attitude towards selecting systems of logic. There's one more thing that should be said about this before I go right into talking about paradoxes, the other topic of today. And that is that systems of logic are created to represent logic as we in fact use it. And the way we in fact use it, I've said, is fundamentally based on intuition. Intuitions about what follows from what must follow from what. However, sometimes, if we're presented with something that maybe we're not used to thinking about, and we see something unusual, like maybe we think, this type of thing usually follows, and then you apply it to a particular situation where it seems like it should also follow there, but then you get something ridiculous, right? You can question your intuitions, right? And when you question your intuitions, they might eventually change, right? And so that means that actually going through the logical selection process, this process of selecting for logical systems, can cause you to question some of your intuitions about what follows from what. Maybe if there's a logical system that seems for the most part great, and then it gives you only, two arguments that you put in came out wrong, you might think, well, okay, am I so sure about them? And then you might see them in a new light and question your intuitions. Point is, your intuitions can change, which makes this process somewhat stable, right? I originally painted it as a process in which, you have the intuitions and now the system just wants to mimic those. But actually, it's a bit more dynamic than that. And that instability of actually the process of considering the virtues of these logical systems impacting what our intuitions actually are makes it so that, again, we shouldn't expect to be able to find one kind of timeless logical system. That, in fact, we should expect that some of the contexts that can affect what the appropriate logic is, that is time, right? That actually, over time, what logic is to us could actually be changing. Okay, that takes us straight into the question of what a paradox is. Because paradoxes are basically things that cause us to question our intuitions about logic in exactly that way. So, precisely, a paradox is a valid argument in which all the premises seem to be true, all the the laws of logic connecting the premises to the conclusion also seem to all be correct, but the conclusion seems to be obviously false, usually just outright absurd, right? So when I phrase it that way, we see that there's really three ways out of a paradox. A paradox is something that wants to be solved. It's a problem, and there's three ways to do so. Okay? You can deny one of the premises. You can say, well, okay, I thought all those premises were true, but actually one of them turns out it's false. And that's usually the most tempting way out of a paradox. Because the other ways are, well, you can accept the conclusion. And again, it just so happens in most paradoxes, the conclusion tends to be completely absurd, right? It tends to be something like, there's no such thing as motion, or that's one of my favorites. So usually it's not something you want to do. There's no such thing as colors, or the experience of color is another great one. And then your third option is to actually revise the laws of logic involved. It's to say, well, all those laws of logic seemed right, but given this situation, they can't be right. So you need to invoke an exception, or you need to do something with those laws of logic, because it's not representing how you would actually think about the situation. So paradoxes, because they're made up in this way, they help us to zero in exactly on where it is that our systems of logic don't quite match our intuitions. And they give us that opportunity to question, well, okay, is this just a mistake? Is there just some assumption that we were making that wasn't right about the facts? Or is it actually that what we thought was a sure law of logic is actually wrong, and we need to revise this logical system if it's going to be a candidate for representing logic as we actually use it. Now, I want to say something about the kind of logic that paradoxes are usually framed against, right? So the laws of logic that typically we have in mind when we frame paradoxes, at least when we formally do so, are the laws of classical logic. So let me say something about classical logic. Classical logic has this kind of air about it, like it's something kind of holy, like it's this, that it's like it's that perfect logic that perfectly describes how it is that we actually think about things. In fact, it's pretty far from being that. So classical logic is really just a system of logic that was developed at a particular point in time. It was developed really in the late 1800s, primarily by a guy named Frege, and primarily for mathematical aims, actually. Really, this was a part of a project for creating the foundations of mathematics in a logical way that ended up in this creating what we now call classical logic. What some people may not realize is that even putting paradoxes aside, there are things about classical logic that are very counterintuitive. Probably the most egregious is the material conditional. So the material conditional is classical logic's version of the if-then operation. Right? That's a very fundamental operation of reasoning, of logic, you want to say, right? That if this, then that. In a sense, it's the most fundamental, right? That's kind of like the whole validity thing we talked about, is that if this, then that. So the conditional is always very important. Classical logic has this material conditional, and that's just a fancy name for the way that the conditional works in classical logic. And it is this way. Let's say you have the statement, if A, then B. If it rains outside, then John will have an umbrella. Okay, so this is defined as, this if A then B in classical logic is defined as, it is not the case that both A and not B. Okay, it is not the case that both the first thing is true, the if thing, and the second thing, right, the then thing, that is false. Okay, so I gave the kind of silly example of, okay, if it's raining outside, then John will have an umbrella. Okay, if it's raining and John doesn't have an umbrella, that statement is not true. Okay, and that makes perfect sense, right? That seems like that's exactly what the if then means, so we're good so far. However, every other possible combination of A and B of their truth values, according to classical logic, will make the material conditional true. So here's a couple of examples. If New York is in New Zealand, then 2 plus 2 equals 4. This is true, according to classical logic, right? We have a case where the first thing is, the antecedent is what the first thing is called in logic, right? The antecedent is false, right? New York is not in New Zealand. But the second thing, the consequent, is true. 2 plus 2 is 4, right? This is not that one case that was identified as what makes the conditional false, and so it's true. But it does not seem to actually be the case in terms of regular use of logic that if New York is in New Zealand, then 2 plus 2 equals 4, that has to be true. Another case, if New York is in the US, then World War II ended in 1945. Okay, in this case, we have true and true. Okay, great. Still, does not seem to actually be a case where that seems to necessarily follow one from the other, if then, right? A third one. If World War II ended in 1945, then Irene is not funny. Okay, first part is false. Second part is also false. Irene is funny, as we determined earlier. Right? Again, not one of the cases identified as the false one, and so it's got to be true. All of these are true statements in classical logic. None of them seem right, right? And the issue is really relevance, right? These all seem to be cases where the antecedent and the consequent actually just have nothing to do with each other. And so what are you saying that if one, then the other, right? That doesn't really seem to be how we use if then. It seems like if then, how we actually use it involves relevance. And so obviously this is not perfect, right? Basically classical logic makes this move because it's making a trade-off, right? Classical logic wants to be able to output a truth value no matter what. If you know the truth value of both the antecedent and the consequent, it wants to give you a truth value for the whole conditional no matter what. And so it kind of has, this is the best that it can do. Now notice, right? It's going for a certain kind of completeness and elegance, but sacrificing somewhat, I would say, on the agreement with data, right? And that's a move that classical logic does, many people would say that it's defensible. I mean, it certainly is defensible. Many people would say that it's absolutely the right move to make. Point is, you can see that it's not obvious or that it's not something that should be uncontroversial. it's actually something really counterintuitive. So now to talk about paradoxes. So I already said a bit about what they are and the fact that they're usually measured against classical logic. I want to give an example to kind of wrap things up today. And this example is what this podcast is named after, the paradox of the barber. So here's the scenario. There's a barber in some town who shaves everyone and only those people who do not shave themselves in the town. Does this barber shave himself? So if you reason through this, right, you'll see that, okay, wait a minute. Let's say that the barber does shave himself. If he does, then he's somebody who does shave himself, which means he wouldn't qualify as being somebody who does not shave himself. So he actually wouldn't shave himself if he shaved himself. Well, okay, so maybe then he doesn't shave himself. But then he would qualify as one of those people whom he does shave. And so he would have to shave himself, right? So if he does shave himself, he doesn't. And if he doesn't, then he does. Well, what's going on? I want to actually, since I gave this whole idea, this whole thing about how paradoxes are true premises and false conclusion and all that, I won't normally necessarily do this because it can sometimes mean getting too into the weeds of technicalities of logic, which I don't usually want to do. But for this case, I think it's instructive to actually go a bit deeper into the actual step-by-step premise, conclusion. Okay? So let's go first premise. There exists a town with a barber who meets the following conditions. For all people in the town, the barber shaves them if and only if they do not shave themselves. Okay. Premise 2. The barber is a person in this town. Now, both of these premises, again, are just premises. They're kind of just given. Okay. 3. The barber shaves himself if and only if he does not shave himself. Okay. That follows from the first two premises and from universal instantiation. Okay. It's a case of some property applies to some category, and then next premise is here's something or somebody that's a member of that category. Therefore, the property will apply to that member, right? So in this case, it's the general rule and the categories given in the first premise. Then the fact that the barber himself is a member of that category is given in the second premise, and so that characteristic will apply to the barber as well. Okay, and that's where we get that the barber shaves himself if and only if he does not shave himself. Okay, from there, it's a fairly easy step to the final conclusion, which is that the barber both shaves and does not shave himself. Okay, that follows from essentially what if and only if means in conjunction with, I suppose you would need the law of excluded middle, which I don't want to go into too much detail there, but it's just a law that says that that it's always the case given some statement, it's always the case that it's either true or false, right? So it's going to either be the case that it's going to either be true or false that the barber shaves himself, and then from there, and that if and only if, it'll take you straight to the barber both shaves and does not shave himself. We've got this contradiction. That's the argument. So again, we can look at those three ways out that I spelled out earlier, right? We can, first of all, deny a logical law, right? So we can say, well, maybe universal instantiation doesn't really work, or maybe the law of excluded middle doesn't really work. Now, all of these are fairly doing that is fairly counterintuitive. It's a big move, right? It's like sort of a lot to do in response to this kind of story about the barber. Like if that was our only option, we would feel like that this is kind of drastic to have to do because of some barber story, right? We can accept the conclusion. We can accept that the barber does shave himself and doesn't shave himself. And that seems really ridiculous, right? The only way that I could think to respond to that is just to say, what do you mean? Which is it? Right? It cannot be both. That doesn't fit in the world that he both shaves and does not shave himself. Or, of course, like I said, always the most tempting, we can deny a premise. And in this case, That is the obvious, easy answer. Of course, we can deny a premise. We can deny the first premise, which is that, there's a town where this barber actually exists. This barber does not exist, cannot exist. There is no such barber, right? In fact, we've just seen a very good argument for why there can be no such barber. And so, we deny the first premise, actually not true premise. And so, bam, resolved, right? Actually, this is not a paradox because it's so obvious what to do with it. A paradox is a paradox because, in part because the premises actually seem to be true. Here, we had no reason to really think that these premises were true to begin with, or at least that first one. So, however, you might think, okay, so what's the deal with the barber? It's a great example of how paradoxes work, with that detail about the fact that the premises usually seem to actually be compelling. Otherwise, this is a great example of kind of how paradoxes work and what it is that we have to do to deal with them. And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com/feed. Join me next time for an introduction to the liar paradox and its variations. Thank you so much for listening.